following on our topics of performance and how to make things work better and faster, we're actually being joined this afternoon by Tom Dale, the Director of Customer Success and Enablement at Imagix. Tom it's good to have you here. It's worked with companies like Versal, The Guardian, Zillow, Reddit, Unsplash, Bustle. We got more jam in the jar with Headless and Jamstack websites and launching a headless website tutorial. Timely in the US, at least, given the whole Halloween kind of thing. I mean, if we're going to go headless, then this is the time of year to do it. Welcome, Tom. Tell
Thanks,
us
Jason.
some new
How's
stuff.
it going? Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all for coming to my session. It brings me a lot of joy to actually be able to talk about this topic. I really love talking about, creating headless websites, focusing on web performance. I'm sure everyone keeps saying it's a bummer we're not in person, but I really do have good memories of going to Toronto in 2016 and 19 for this conference. So I really hope, next year, next 2 years, whenever, we'll actually be there together. So it's going to be exciting. So as Jason mentioned, I'm Tom Dale. I lead the customer success org here at Imagix. I've been here over 7 years. I'm just had my third child, and I'm actually just coming off paternity leave now. So it's really great. I have a passion for learning new front-end technologies. I typically build things with Nuxt or Next.js. I try to put all the content I make on my Twitter handle, and I'm sure you're going to be able to remember it. It is at Let's Go Headless. So what can you expect from this talk? Well, I'm going to talk about Jamstack and Headless. That's definitely going to be a thing there, right? I just want to maybe go over little ideas of what they are and what I think they are, and make sure we're on similar notes there, right? We're also going to be throwing in polls throughout the talks here. That way I can just kind of get feedback from you all and share it with you during it, just so we know what the audience, how they're engaged with this kind of topic anyways. So actually, maybe we could put out the first poll right now, talking about your familiarity with Headless and preferences on the front end technology. So we'll get those thrown out in the chat for you here. We're also going to be talking about performance. I think performance is really important for websites, and you certainly get a leg up doing better performance with Jamstack and Headless. So I want to go over that and just go over some real examples. And the target audience is certainly front-end developers, but I think also people that are just interested in the idea of web performance, and the Jamstack web architecture is really good. And anyone really thinking about maybe switching over a website would be good as well, right? So let's go ahead and move on here. So the title of the talk mentions headless, right? But whenever you say that word, you can't not associate Jamstack. They're complementary ideas, and they're both good for performance. I'm sure we've already talked about some of the terms today, but the definitions do vary greatly. So maybe I want to start with one key kind of thought. Headless and Jamstack are definitely not the same thing, right? So what is it? Let me go here. So I kind of like focusing on the idea of what something is not first. That sometimes helps me maybe understand a topic better. So Jamstack is definitely not something that has like a coupled front end and back end service. Typically not server side, but again, Jamstack is just a thought and idea. So ideas constantly do change. Some really just basic key examples of what is not Jamstack might be like a Weebly, Squarespace, Wix, Webflow, apparently W's, so just don't do W's. But, these are website builders, and they're complete packages that give you a UI, and then you fill out the content or the products or whatever in the back end. It deploys it. It's all one concise thing. It is a pretty simple solution, which is why it can be pretty popular, right? I'm certainly going to touch on the idea of positives and negatives later. But now that we kind of just have this brief idea of what maybe Jamstack is not, so what is Jamstack? It's definitely this idea of decoupling that JavaScript front end, right? Decouple that from the data layer, and you're going to connect via APIs. So hearing this idea of JavaScript front ends, APIs, that's definitely going to go with Jamstack in my ear. I also typically, I'm going to hear Vue, React, Gatsby, deploy on Netlify, deploy on Vercel. These are all like major hot words that just yell Jamstack, right? And we do actually have the results from maybe the first poll. Already have the idea of how familiar are you with Jamstack or not, and it's pretty across the board, right? I think we got about a quarter of you work with it quite familiar, a quarter of you have barely heard, I've heard a little bit, and a quarter of you not familiar at all. So there you go. We got the first results there, and I think we got the second poll out there. Just to be curious about what front ends that you're working with too, so we can do that as well. All right, so this is the classic jam definition, right? JavaScript APIs markup. But just want to be very clear, Jamstack is an idea, a style of architecting a website. It's not a product. It's not a thing. That's definitely something, right? So it can always evolve, always change. Generally, the J stands for JavaScript, but more importantly, it's the front end code that's responsible for displaying the content the site receives. The code is then decoupled from the content, so it can remain very flexible when you're building out and making changes. So that content is coming from the API, right? A Jamstack site needs to be able to connect to several types of APIs coming from services generating your content. That connection allows you to connect with various services for all your needs. So for example, Snipcart, it may be a really great shopping cart product management service. But if you're doing blogs, Contentful is going to be much better at managing that content. And sorry to say, neither of them are very good at like image optimization. So you need to find a way to take the best from each of these things and create a great site from that. And to be able to do that, you can piecemeal it with Jamstack and create that great service. So, and then finally, we have the M. The M stands for markup. I think it just be simply thought of HTML if you just want to kind of cut corners and just get to a basic definition. The key is that the markup is pre-built and cached via a CDN. So you want to speed up the site by offering ways to also dynamically insert that content into the markup, and we'll talk about that a little more as well. So that was just Jamstack real quick, but what about Headless? I said they're not the same, but they're definitely related. Well, I left out some classic examples of sites that products that people always mention when they mention Jamstack. WordPress, Drupal, Shopify. Everyone loves bringing those up as examples of things that aren't Jamstack, and people famously leave WordPress to create a Jamstack site because WordPress is slow, right? Well, WordPress, Drupal, Shopify, they're evolving in this way to where they can actually make their content accessible via an API. And they're making it into like a headless API. There's still that classic monolithic WordPress thing out there, but you very much so can alter the product now to take a Jamstack site and access that content in your WordPress via an API, and no longer have the slow WordPress site and have it be performant. So headless comes in that idea of again, that A in Jamstack, that API, right? You need to connect to different products, different headless CMSs, headless commerce solutions, and have those power your sites. And we quickly here have the polls on the front end, and it is a clear sweep. React is the winner on that. Vue did come in a distant second place. And you might have noticed I didn't mention like Next.js or Nuxt.js in those, but I would consider React to be Next.js, for example, right? Yeah. So here we go. Sorry, I keep interrupting with the poll ideas, but I really like the idea of just hearing who's out there and what you guys all work on. And you are going to enjoy this idea of later the example I did do in Next.js. So let's talk a little bit more about maybe headless CMSs. And another great time to throw out our final two questions for the poll about which CMSs you're maybe familiar with and what commerce solutions. But yeah, so I mentioned the idea, Jamstack sites are connecting via the API to the content of the site, and it's a headless content or commerce solution. This is like a here's just like a graphic showing all of them, right? And this is not all of them. This is just a ton of them. There's so many out there, right? But it's just showing this idea that you can have a product and have a choice of choosing any product you want. You can fill it in easily to your Jamstack site. You can switch it. It's really important for a Jamstack site to be decoupled and be easily filled in with this data from a headless site, because then you can always stay future-proofed, always have that best technology that you prefer. So just kind of showing this idea that there's lots of different CMSs out there. I'll be interested to see what types you are all familiar with. You know, I personally work a lot with the Cosmic, Prismic, Datto, TakeShape teams, Contentful a decent amount as well, and Sanity and Craft. So and I do a lot of WordPress stuff, because I'm telling you, the fact that WordPress can generate these headless APIs is very intriguing as well to me. So headless, it's referring to that idea of the head being the content, right? Displaying that front end. So you can see it kind of broken down in this graphic, this dashing line cutting through and just severing the head, being the API layer here, right? And the body is where the content is stored. So the back end, the CMS, e-com solution, whatever it is. There's multiple. Now, the thing is, companies, they can display their content to users in so many different ways. You can have a website. You can have Apple and Android apps, watches, billboards, Roku TV, Apple TV. There's so many ways to display things to the end users. And if you were to have a traditional coupled solution, the head is connected to the body. Each time you're creating this new app, this new way to show something to your users, you're going to have to also create that new backend. And it becomes very unwieldy, because you have to keep managing content in many different places, and your content could easily become different. It's not the same messaging, just a very complex thing, and it becomes very difficult to become omni-channel as well, right? So if we were to instead say you need a headless CMS, I mean, it's honestly kind of a funny term. It's not really headless. It's really like you need 8 heads connecting to one body. That's the real benefit here, is that you can keep swapping out the heads and keep that same body, because I only want to put all my content in one place, in one tool, and then have that content be requested out to every different location where users are getting their info. So that way you can get your info out to so many different channels and only have to manage that one backend. And you have the freedom to create all these different other front ends. And if you need to switch them, you never have to worry about modifying that backend. It becomes much easier to do it. That's really the core benefits of headless and how headless works. I think we have another result here from the polls here. All right. So we do have a lot of WordPress people familiar out there, and then a decent amount in the headless CMS world as well, and only one in Contentful, which I'm beyond shocked. But yeah, so a lot of WordPress folks out there. Be really interested to see if you all are even doing the headless side or not. And then thinking on the e-commerce side, everyone marked Shopify, right? So Shopify is certainly like a well-known solution out there, but not really like an enterprise one, right? But it's a really great example for one that is starting to go headless. I mean, realistically, they were always headless before. You could always access the content, but now they're doing hydrogen and oxygen, that kind of stuff, to really push towards that model of headless as well. So just, the takeaway here is headless and decoupling. Those are the things that kind of mean that same idea. You can always swap in these different components easily because you're just connected via this API layer. And you can really have many heads, each head being all the different places that you interact with someone. So let's talk about the idea of the benefits of doing this Jamstack headless site versus this traditional. And I guess when I say traditional, maybe I'm thinking like the monolithic classic thing. And if I keep using different words, forgive me, but that's essentially what I mean, right? So looking at Jamstack, you do have this ability to solve for both a good user experience and a good developer experience. 'Cause since everything's decoupled, you can ensure that the users being the people that are like making your content for your site, right? Like the internal users, they're able to enter their content or products and remain happy by choosing whatever product they want. If they want to stay on a product like WordPress, then they never have to get retrained or change. Or if they all hate their product, they can switch to another. They can constantly switch and do whatever they like, and it won't affect what the developers are doing on their side of the front end, right? So you give this good experience to those internal users there, and then equally give this good experience to the developers, because the developers get to choose what kind of front end technology they're familiar with, which one they prefer to work with. If something changes down the line, they can switch it out, and it doesn't have to force the other people to switch how they're managing their content. So the next side is really performance, right? And it's such a big topic, and I'm going to cover it a ton more after this, right? But I'm just labeling it here so you know it is really crucial to Jamstack and Headless. I've already touched on this idea of omni-channel and decoupling, right? That's really like a core thing, is being able to serve content, sell content in so many different channels, and it's so much easier with a Jamstack Headless solution. You can take it even further, the idea of just serving in different languages, serving all these different regions. It's really a great site for serving that kind of technology. And then the future proofing, right? If something changes and technology becomes better in a certain way, you can always modify and update without having to take down everything. These sites that are on these really old solutions, they would love probably to switch to this nice new future technology, but it's just so expensive and so much work because they'd have to demolish everything they built. That's what makes it so difficult for them. Versus people that are adopting these Jamstack Headless methods, they're just having to modify one small chunk here and there to continue to stay on the forefront of technology and performance. And that's really a great benefit. So now switching over to the traditional side, right? Right away, it's a low code option. It's giving you probably a WYSIWYG editor too. You feel like you have a lot of control because you have this box you can move around, but realistically, it's not always the greatest, right? You just get to modify some aspects, but the low code is really good. So that's a really good benefit on the traditional side there. You do have a lot more integrations, like official integrations. Jamstack had this, you can really push things together and make things connect, but there's a lot more of these official integrations and themes on the traditional side. Usually there's a marketplace, you click a button, it goes together, really simple. And there's a really big market for that because that traditional side has been around a lot longer. Since these things are kind of low code, the integration is kind of a click and a simple add-on, it means it's a lot faster to get deployed. The site isn't faster, but it's just ready and deployed faster. So that's really a good benefit there as well. And you really just have this established history for them, right? They've been around a long time. You have a lot of companies that have been using these products. I can sit here all day and say the Jamstack and Headless, it's more performant, you should use that. But you also have this other side of these larger enterprise companies going, well, there's no risk to my job to look to see what that other company did and just do the same thing. No one's going to be upset at me for doing that established true thing. The real risk is me taking a leap of faith just to go to a new technology out there and risk everything. So it's kind of a stumping of innovation, but it's why they're continuing to be beneficial is that history is there. It's simple for people to choose. They've already seen many other companies succeed there, so they just continue to go with more and more of the same. One other thing is they probably have much less products to log into. If you have that front end and back end connected together, it's coupled together, it's one thing to log into. Unless they're trying to go omni-channel, then there's way more products to log into. But if not, it's a simple one thing to log into versus the Jamstack Headless world. They have several different components, and people might get irritated. You have to log into different products that are for the content or the commerce or whatever, right? So now let's look at these cons. So a really large con for the Jamstack headless sites is the reliance on third-party services. Um, Many different services that are powering your site, the more you add, the more risk that if one goes down, it could mess it up, right? Or one disappears or one fails, right? You have a lot more points of failure, I guess, right? And that's always a con that a lot of companies will mention for the not choosing to go there. If you were using Shopify in a traditional sense and you just use Shopify for everything, then you only have a failure point for Shopify and their CDN Fastly. That's it. So maybe companies prefer that safety sometimes, right? If your team is not familiar with Jamstack ahead of this, they have to learn new things. That's certainly a con. And even as you future-proof and make sure you bring in new technology, then you're constantly learning new things because you need to keep seeing what's out there, keep learning. Me personally, I love constantly learning new things, constantly making new things, and I bet a lot of you do too. But I think certainly some companies would think of it as a con to waste time of their employees to have them learning new things, right? I mentioned the idea of those multiple logins. Here it is as a con on the Jamstack side. And then it's super sad to say that there's a smaller community because we are at a conference. We're all talking about it. We love sharing these things together. But realistically, that traditional monolithic side has a much bigger community, right? So really, it's on us to make that con go away. We need to create more info about Jamstack headless sites. We need to share more with each other. We need to bring in more people to our community, and that'll really help get over that con, I think. So then going to the other side, sure, there's a WYSIWYG editor. Sure, I can edit this text box easy. But if I just don't like the look of that button and the other two buttons that are available in my theme, it's going to be quite difficult to actually change that. It's not going to be going into the JavaScript and doing a simple change. You're now going to have to, hire an agency or who knows what. It's really difficult to change things beyond just the basic items that you can change on a traditional site. So that's a certainly humongous con. And since you are less and less likely to change things and you're just choosing from this list of basic themes, just more and more of the internet looks like clones of each other, right? Because they're just the same sites here and there. I mean, especially if I think about the media news world, like if you're dipping into different cities and different websites, they are all literally identical. They all look the same. So, that's a real big con, I think, for me, is that you don't want your site to look identical to the other ones. I'm going to still talk more on performance real quick, but the traditional sites certainly are slower, bad SEO. And then expensive with a caveat. There are, WordPress can certainly be free-ish. Wix and those ones can be free-ish. But if you're an enterprise solution and a company and you want to go for a traditional side of Salesforce Commerce Cloud, you're probably spending a couple $1 million to set it up with an agency. So it can be really, really expensive. You would never spend that much on a Jamstack headless setup. So there's just a much higher, much more expensive ceiling on that traditional side as well. So I keep saying Jamstack and headless sites are performant. Why are they performant? Well, there's just the basic idea and the architecture of how it's built makes several items inherently more likely to help your site be more performant. The first fact is the site is being statically built well before the site is ever visited by a user. That markup portion, it's being converted into HTML, being served, indexed, cached. It's really good for SEO purposes, really good for viewing purposes. It makes it really, really fast. And yes, some items are still dynamically built. For example, product data, shopping carts. And this is something where like Next.js or Nuxt.js are particularly handy. You're statically creating the site. You're focusing on statically creating the UI and then hydrating the remaining portions at the actual time of the request. It's still good performance because that UI portion and the site is loaded, and then the rest is dynamically inserted on the edge. These CDNs are just becoming smarter and smarter and smarter. I like to call them modern CDNs now. The old CDNs were just focusing on having this race of lots of caches all over the world and hoping to get a pop really close to you, and that was the way they won. But these modern CDNs, on the edge in those pops, they're allowing you to make those dynamic changes to content, so it becomes really, really fast. You can take that static portion of the site on the edge, insert your dynamic items, and it's still extremely fast, much faster than the traditional side of having to go to the server and get everything there. So I know pretty much me just telling you all you should use a CDN sounds pretty obvious, but so here's a graphic from the 2021 Web Almanac from HTTP Archives. For the top 1,000 websites, only 61% of requests are actually being served via CDN. If you switch to the top 1 million sites, only 33% of sites. So there's still so much more room to grow around using CDNs better. And then finally, Jamstack sites tend to be more performant because of that additional option you have of using these third-party alternatives. When you use a monolithic solution, you're stuck using all the technology that they have chosen. You can't modify or anything. But when you do that Jamstack headless site, you get to insert all these different things that are theoretically much more performant. So that's why inherently it will typically be much more performant as a site. I'm not selling you the cure-all pill that will make all websites faster. You can absolutely go and make a Jamstack site and make it horrible and make it slow. It happens all the time, right? So maybe you just want to talk about that idea of the typical things you still need to do. I mean, generally, I just mentioned you go and choose third-party things to plug into your Jamstack site. If you choose bad third-party things, it's obviously going to make it much slower, right? And still, a lot of those general practices that you probably know as a developer, they still exist here. You wouldn't put a link to a large third-party CSS or JavaScript file in the head section, and you only needed it for just one little button. You wouldn't do that because that's just going to be really unperformant. It doesn't matter how much you cache that. That's not a good idea. You can certainly add in all kinds of third-party scripts. I know you need marketing. I know you need ads, but at some point, if you add too many, the Jamstack site architecture is not going to solve that problem. You can only do so much, right? And image optimization, that's a really big one. I haven't mentioned it much yet, but I do work at Imagix. Imagix is a media optimization platform. I've been there for 7 years. I've seen all kinds of crazy ideas for images that slow down your website. And there's just so much there that you still need to do to optimize your site. So if you have that Jamstack site and you didn't optimize your images, it's still going to be slow. If I go back again to that Web Almanac 2021 report, on average, the page weight of your images is still more than your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript combined. So you still can't forget to optimize the largest portion of your website. So when I'm building my Jamstack sites, how am I deciding if I've made bad decisions or good decisions? Well, just by default, I use Google PageSpeed or Lighthouse. Those are powered by the same thing. You could just go to web.dev and find the tool there. You can right-click in a Chrome browser, and there's an audit tab that'll do it as well. It's really going to, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a report that brings in actual user data and lab data on the web page. It offers recommendations to improve performance. It focuses on core web vitals, which are performance signals that are critical to the web experience. And it's just showing these ideas of what you should do. So I just want to quickly do 2 sites and do actual page speed scores and see what we get here, right? So just recently, I did make a Jamstack site to host a lot of demos we were building at Imagix. I built it doing Next.js, Tailwind CSS, Cosmic as the CMS, Imagix, and Vercel to deploy. I then went and made a Weebly site. I used one of their themes. I WYSIWYG'd my days away to get as close as I could, and made that as well. And I ran page speed scores on both of those. So I'm going to show you the numbers, and I'll quickly unshare out of the presentation and show you the actual page speed reports as well. Obviously, we wouldn't be having this talk if the number was good over here on the Weebly side, right? But The Weebly side was 48. The Jamstack was 92. And all these kind of metrics are the ones we're really focusing on. I know we're getting close to the 30-minute mark, so I'm actually just going to unshare and go to the actual paid speed reports to show them to you. All right. So let's do that here. Here we go. So running on my side, like I said, it had a 92, and then the desktop was a 99, right? Let's focus a lot on this Weebly one instead, right? So sitting here at a 48. So it's giving these general scores here that are all not so good, but what I want to focus on is this idea of what they list here as things that are good and bad. So let me zoom in here. So it literally lays it out real easy for you. The very first thing it's actually saying here is these images are not in next gen formats, right? And it's going to list and show every image and say what's wrong with them. It's going to say that the images aren't sized. Now it's going to talk over here and say, hey, you've got all these different files, these JavaScript and CSS files. They should be delivered inline and defer them so they don't delay the actual load of the site. So this is what's delaying a lot of the site. Again, things that are typical of a traditional monolithic site, like a Weebly site, not something that would happen with a Jamstack site, right? You have, a lot of unused JavaScript. You could certainly pile in tons of unused JavaScript in a Jamstack site, right? But typically, it's not something you do. It's a lot easier to not do that versus you don't have a choice with these Weebly sites. They just load everything in there, and that's what you get. And there's always going to be extra. It's always going to slow it down. Let's even go to that the little CDN game right here, static assets. You can see all these assets they have. Absolutely no CDN in front of them at all. They're not doing any CDN. Here's some that have 2 hours, 1 day, even these 14-day ones. These are all triggering negatively there because Google wants them to be 30 days or more. So it's bonkers to me that, again, we have this site. It's a very common modern technology to use CDNs, but here we are not using it because who knows what reason Weebly is choosing not to do it, right? So lots of these items all building up that idea of how a headless Jamstack site is typically more performant because it wouldn't come up with these things when I go to build them. Looking at my site here, we had much better scores in the speed, the interactivity. I still have a couple unused JavaScript. It's probably me did some silly component and left it in, right? But these are very minimal, small items compared to what we're seeing over here. These are critical problems that you would never be able to solve. You can't solve them with Weebly. You would literally need to switch to another solution to get away from this. So yeah, so let me quickly switch back here, and I know I'm cutting a little bit into our Q&A. So I'll be done in 1 second. Just wanted to give maybe one final note that so I do work at Imagix, as I mentioned, right? And Imagix is one of the great core components for adding the API aspect to your Jamstack site. There's a free forever account. I really suggest just going to use it. We've had images for a long time now, and we've also recently added video optimization, and it's just such a core, great, amazing product. I would really suggest trying it out, watching some of the videos on our YouTube site, following us on Twitter, and just let us know if you need anything. And otherwise, I do have I'll leave this open for a sec, but there's a link to the presentation. Maybe I'll maybe actually type it in the chat so you could all get it yourself as well. So thanks so much.
Tom, thank you so much. That was fantastic. There's so much good discussion going on in the chat. I think we could spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but so before we get to, I think what I think is one of the meatiest things is there a free or open source headless CMS that you would recommend folks try out?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the ones I've used myself would be Prismic, Cosmic, Data CMS, Contentful, they all have free plans. But if you want to think of maybe an open source free one, I like Craft CMS a lot. I think that's one I would go with.
Great. And I guess it's fair to point out that you can use WordPress and Drupal as a headless CMS. You still have to host it somewhere, but at least it is something that people can try out.
Yeah, you would have to spin up something to still keep that backend running, right?
Right.
But otherwise, you would be using, React, I guess, because everyone loves React in this presentation, in this group. You would just be using probably GraphQL to connect to the headless to WordPress. Mm-hmm. It's a really simple way of bringing in the content, and it's really performant because GraphQL wouldn't bring in all the content you've written. It's very specific, and it would very much bring in certain aspects of what you actually need for the site, so you don't bring in too much content to slow it down.
I think that actually feeds really nicely into a question from Hamid about the speed of the WordPress API compared to other headless options. And I'm going to add to that, and does it really matter?
Yeah, so I think, again, the speed is coming because you're pre-building out a lot of that, right? Like the items that are in there aren't that dynamic, right? Like, again, it depends what kind of site you're doing, but it's being sped up so much by being pre-generated, sent out in that markup, and pre-filling out there. So I think I've never worried that much about the WordPress API slowing it down from more of a static kind of blog-ish type site. I don't know if I would necessarily use it to fill commerce, but I would absolutely feel fine still doing it for content and blogging and things like that. I think one big win still of WordPress is that you typically have teams that continue to use WordPress and they're just familiar with it and they don't want to be trained on something else, right? So offering that ability of you as a developer going, hey, I have this amazing new thing I want to do to our website, and don't worry, I'm not going to change anything about your life. You still can do all the same things you want to do is such a great selling point.
Right. And before we drift into some of the discussion I was having with Derek and others in the chat, I think the common line that I have heard over and over and over again with clients is, our data, our content, our something, or whatever it is dynamic. Are we going to be okay? Like, how fast is fast enough for that front end to be rendering this content as it changes? What's a good way to talk about that? And what are some solutions to leverage Jamstack when connected to a headless setup to still get the kinds of performance that you would hope for when it comes to that new content being published?
Yeah, so I definitely think these more advanced frameworks like Next.js, Nuxt.js, or Gatsby are particularly good at handling those, right? And then team them up with a modern CDN that's doing a lot of smart stuff on the edge. Cloudflare, Vercel, Netlify, they're doing those really smart things in there. So you can bring in that dynamic content a lot closer to where the request is actually happening. So then it's still very, very fast. When you think about that dynamic content on a traditional side, they're having to really just go to the servers or go wherever and get all that content and bring it back. And it's inherently going to really lower that time to first byte and that initial reactivity and make just the beginning of the site slower versus that Jamstack portion. The beginning of the site will be much faster, but then it might take a little bit on the end of the tail for that dynamic content to come in. But you would much rather have someone be on a site, have it be partially loaded, have them interacting and moving around a little, and versus just looking at nothing, right? So I think even if it's not faster, it's a much better experience because you're being able to interact yourself and you feel like it's faster because you're getting to do something sooner.
That's a really interesting way to characterize it. I hadn't really put it in those terms. Now, is that something that is that sort of an event-driven kind of thing? So I hit publish on my new press release. That shows up as a detail page on the press release page, on the main page of the news, on the listing of the latest things on the homepage. How is that kind of thing managed best in a Jamstack site? I know that you can't exactly comment on things too specifically, but in general, how do we handle an event-driven kind of update like that?
Yeah. So if I have, let's say you come to my site, I might have my header, my hero stuff, my background, the footer, all that kind of stuff is always going to be the same. The UI, the items that make the site kind of work, that all is going to be loaded first, loaded statically and appear there, right? And then after that's loaded, then the individual content blog posts are going to appear, right? And that's taking a little bit longer because it is looking to see, did you just make a new update? Did you just put out something brand new, right? And that's fine, again, I think, if that's a little bit lower, because the perceived speed is much higher since everything else at least finished and they can interact and move around a little and have some kind of content. Because even if your new thing you posted isn't quite there yet and they scrolled down and quickly missed it, at least they're still doing things on your site, versus if they go to the site and there's nothing there, they're going to leave quick. 2.7 seconds, they're gone. 3 seconds, they're gone. They need to be interacting, doing something. They can't wait that long with nothing, with no response, no visual anything.
So in your experience with all of these different platforms and technologies, one of the conversations that I was having with Derek and a few other folks in the chat was around actually finding somebody who has swapped out a headless backend or swapped out a front end without just ending up redoing the whole thing anyway. I know like the promise of separating these things is that in theory you could do that. And I'm being a little bit cynical in asking this question, but I am genuinely curious if you've encountered people that have done that successfully, leaving the front end exactly as it is, or vice versa, keeping the back end and introducing a whole new front end.
Yeah, I remember an entire media group in Scandinavia that had, I don't know, they had like 50 websites all throughout Scandinavia that were news sites, and they were all on Drupal. And the big dream was leave it Drupal, but change that front end, right? And they were able to do that with Next.js and use Imagix to power the images, and then deployed it with, man, I think it was maybe Cloudflare. And yeah, it was absolutely something they were able to do easily. And then going from there, it was just so easy for them to add more and more websites and get more and more ways to deliver content out. And those end users, I remember, still kept using Drupal, and we kept laughing about it because I was like, dear God, I would never want to use that. But here that was what they've always been using, and they didn't have to migrate content or migrate blogs or do all that kind of stuff. They all got to stay the same, which was maybe a much less cost incurred, right? And maybe one day they do want to switch it out, but they didn't have to do it all at once. They only had to do one aspect. They only had to do that front end part, and maybe later they can do the other part if they want, right? But it's much easier to make that smaller, not change everything, right? But yeah, it's definitely something that's absolutely very possible. We have tons of customers that are constantly always doing it. And I think you're just seeing more and more of this. These classic, top 1,000 websites, they can't continue to be bad performing sites, right? Like, how long can whoever Macy's and them wait to just die in these malls and not figure out a way to change how they do things, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of sites that are adopting a much better online presence and are finding ways to be much more performant. And it's certainly very, very possible.
Well, that's awesome, and I can't wait to check out Imagix and play around with that with some of the Jamstack sites that I maintain for my little projects. So, Tom, thank you so much for everything that you've shared today. I think this was some really, really fascinating stuff. It's really kind of fit beautifully in with conversations from Addie and from Harry earlier today, and Brian, and it's all flowed really nicely, and Imagix certainly is a big part of addressing some of those things that people have brought up. So thank you for all of that.
Thanks so much, Jason. And again, really, like, if my email is tom@imagix.com, you can certainly email me. Really, just I think you should tweet me at Let's Go Headless. I would love to help any ideas for what you're doing at Jamstack sites. If you want to just run a page speed thing and wonder what all these things mean, I do it all the day, every day, all the time. It's all I do. So I would love to look at yours and help you. I'm more than
Awesome.
happy to do it and share it. So